Spiritual Theology, Part 11. Purification of the will. The will, also called the rational appetite, is the faculty by which we seek the good as known by the intellect. It is distinguished from sensitive appetite, which instinctively seeks the good as known by the senses. Even the animals possess a sensitive appetite, but the rational appetite is proper to intellectual beings. The proper object of the will is the good proposed to it by the intellect, but in appreciation or evaluation of the good, error may creep in. The intellect can judge as a true good something that is only an apparent good, and the will, which is a blind faculty and always follows the apprehension of the intellect, will be impelled towards that object that is taken as if it were a true good. The proper act of the will is love, or the effective union of the will with a known good. All the movements or partial aspects of the human acts will take place in the will, such as simple volition, efficacious tendencies, consent, active uses of the faculties, and fruition proceed from love, directly or indirectly. Love can be divided in many ways. The principal divisions for our purposes is the following. By the reason of the object, love can be sensual or spiritual, and by reason of modality, love can be natural or supernatural. By the reason of the formal object or motive, love can be a love of concupiscence or of benevolence. It is called a love of concupiscence when one desires the good as far as it is good for oneself, egotistic movement. It is a love of benevolence if one loves another precisely so far as the other is good and lovable. It is a love of friendship if the love is directed to a person and is a mutual beneficent love. Thus, the sensual person loves with a love of concupiscence the object that gives pleasure. Blessed in heaven habitually love God with a love of benevolence, taking complacence in the infinite imperfection, and choice in rejoicing that God is infinitely happy in himself, and that the blessed in heaven and in the people are sanctified by grace here on earth, love God with the love of friendship under the impulse of the virtue of charity. Acts of the will may be elicited or imperated. They are called elicited if they proceed directly from the will, such as to consent, to choose, to love. They are called imperated, commanded, acts when they are performed by some other faculty under the commandment of the will, such as to study, to paint, to mortify oneself voluntarily. As we have already seen, human nature and all its faculties were profoundly affected by original sin. Once the orientation to God has been weakened, the dominion of reason over the sensible faculties was also weakened, and the will itself was readily inclined to selfishness. Hence the necessity of a double effort involved in the rectification of the will, one required to be the subject by God by means of total submission and conformity to his divine will, the other to increase the power of the will with regard to the inferior faculties until it can them completely to themselves. In other words, one must attempt to regain, at the cost of great effort and with the help of grace, the initial rectitude that the will employed when it came forth from the creative hand of God. It should be evident that we cannot achieve total submission to our will to God unless we first detach ourselves from the excessive love of created things and from the self-centered love that runs counter to the demands of charity. St. John of the Cross reduces his whole spiritual doctrine to this detachment from creatures as the negative element, and to union with God through love as a positive element. It is a fact that the soul is filled with God in the measure and to the degree that it empties itself of creatures. The reasons for the necessity of attachment from creatures for perfect union with God, as stated by the St. John of the Cross, can be summarized in the following synthesis. 1. God is all, the necessary and absolute being, most pure act with the shadow of potency, who exists of himself and possesses the absolute plenitude of being. Compared with him, creatures are nothing, and they are contingent beings that have more potency than have act. Two contraries cannot exist in the same subject because they mutually exclude each other. Therefore, light is incomparable with darkness, and the all is incompatible with nothing. If, then, creatures are nothing and darkness, and God is the all and light, it follows that the soul wishes to be united with God must detach himself from creatures. Without this, the union with God is impossible. Hence it is necessary that the way and ascent to God should consist in mortifying the desires. Until these desires cease, the soul will not arrive at a perfect union, although it may exercise many virtues, because it still does not perform those virtues with perfection, which requires that the soul must be purged of every inordinate desire. Some persons burden themselves with extraordinary penances and many other exercises and think that this or that will suffice for them to arrive at a union with divine wisdom. 5. Some persons burden themselves with extraordinary penances and many other exercises, and think that this or that will suffice for them to arrive at union with divine wisdom. If they would exert half the effort in mortifying their desires, they would advance more in 1 month. Through this practice than they would in many years by means of the other exercises. Just as it is necessary that one labor over the earth if it can bear fruit, when without labor it will bear nothing but weeds, so also mortification of the appetites is necessary, if there is to be any fruit or profit in the soul. St. John of the Cross develops these thoughts throughout his writings, when they teach both the negative element of detachment and the positive element of the love of God. Actually, the system of St. John the Cross can be reduced to one important statement: God is all. His negations rest on affirmation, because they have as their object the detachment of the soul from the false appearances of the creatures in order to enable the soul, purified and ennobled, to lose itself in the profundity of the all. He does not disdain creatures. He only wishes to help the soul see in creature and the traces and vestiges of divine being. But no one can arrive at the all except by the narrow path of the absolute negation of the nothing. In order to arrive at having pleasure at everything, desire to have pleasure in nothing. In order to arrive at possessing everything, desire to possess nothing. In order to arrive at being everything, desire to be nothing. In order to arrive at knowing everything, desire to know nothing. In order to arrive at that which you have no pleasure, you must go by a way of which you have no pleasure. In order to arrive at that which you do not know, you must go by a way which you do not know. In order to arrive at which you do not possess, you must go by a way that you do not possess. In order to arrive at that which you are not, you must go through that which you are not. When your mind dwells on anything, you are no longer casting yourself upon the all. In order to pass from all to the all, you must deny yourself wholly in all. When you come to possess it wholly, you must possess it without desiring anything. And if you will have anything in all, having all, you do not have your treasury purely in God. St. John of the Cross does not intend to annihilate the natural tendencies of human nature by removing them from their object and leaving them suspended in a vacuum. He wishes to orientate them to God, to make God the only object of the soul. It is true that this can never be attained perfectly until the soul has been introduced to the passive purgations. But God does not usually compete the purification of the soul until the soul has done all that it can by using the ordinary means within its grasp. For that reason, St. John of the Cross repeats with insistence that one must mortify the desire that divide the forces of the soul. When the soul has become detached from creatures, it will be filled with God. Detachment from created things is absolutely indispensable for arriving at Christian perfection, but it would be of little avail to detach oneself from external things if one is not likewise detached from one's own ego, which constitute the greatest of all the obstacles of one's free flight to God. St. Thomas states that egoism is disordered self-love, is the origin and root of all sin. St. Augustine says, "Two loves have erected two cities. Self-love, carried to the extreme disdain of God, has built the city of the world. The love of God, carried to the point of disdain for oneself, has constructed the city of God. One glorifies in itself, the other glories in the Lord." Precisely because the manifestations of self-love are varied and almost infinite, so far as it affects spiritual things, self-love becomes the center around which everything else must rotate. Some persons seek themselves in everything, even in holy things, in prayer which they prolong when they find sweetness and consolation in it, but which they abandon when they experience aridity, in the reception of the sacraments, which they seek only for sensible consolation, in spiritual direction, which they consider a note of distinction, and in which therefore they always seek the director who is most popular, or who will let them live in peace with their egoistic values and selfish aims. In the very desire for sanctification, which they do not subordinate to the greater glory of God and the good of souls, but which they direct to themselves as the best ornament of their souls here on earth, and as the source of increased happiness and glory in heaven. We would never finish if we were to attempt to list the manifestations of excessive self-love. The soul that aspires to perfect union with God must strive energetically against its own self-love, which subtly penetrates even holy things. It must examine the true motive for its actions, continually rectify its intentions, and not place as its goal or the goal of all its activities and efforts anything other than the glory of God and the perfect fulfillment of his divine will. It must keep constantly in mind the decisive words of Christ himself, who makes perfect self-abnegation the indispensable condition for following him. Whoever wishes to be my follower must deny his very self, take up his cross each day, and follow in my steps. Luke 9:23. Passive purgations. Up to this point we have been examining the active purifications the soul can effect by its own efforts, with the help of grace in order to purge itself of its defects. Now we shall consider the part that God reserves for himself in the purification of the spirit. Passive purifications, which are divided into the night of the senses and the night of the spirit. Teaching of St. John of the Cross on the necessity of the passive purgations is very clear. In Book 1 of the Dark Night, he treats the imperfections of beginners. After describing these imperfections in the chapters that follow, he terminates with these words: However assiduously the beginner in mortification exercises himself in all these actions and passions, he can never completely succeed, far from it, until God shall effect it in him passively by means of the purgation of said night. To speak of perfection and sanctity without souls having endured any of the passive purifications is to depart radically from the doctrine of St. John of the Cross. It cannot be said, as they who are defenders of the double way have said, that the passive purifications pertain only to those souls who are to attain perfection by the mystical way, and not to those who reach perfection by the ascetical way. St. John of the Cross teaches that, however much the soul may exert itself, it cannot correct its imperfections unless God does this for the soul in a passive manner. Therefore, one or the other conclusion must be accepted. Either we must say that there is a perfection that is filled with imperfections, which is manifestly a contradiction, or there is no other procession than that which results in the passive purification and is manifestly a mystical profession. Theological reason fully confirms the teaching of St. John of the Cross. As a result of original sin, human nature is strongly inclined to evil. Egoism, which is embedded in the very depths of our being, disturbs the clarity of our intellect and impedes our objective view of things, especially when self-love makes us see things through the perspective of its own evaluations. The passive purifications are, therefore, necessary from the very nature of things. Naturally, not all souls will suffer them with the same rigor, because there are many degrees of impurity that have been contracted, and there are many grades of perfection to which various souls are destined. But in every case, in order to conquer egoism, sensual self-love, and the moderate desire for the sensible consolations, the intellectual pride, and whatever opposes the spirit of faith, it is absolutely indispensable that there can be a complete and total renewal of the soul through the passive purgations. This doctrine has the advantage of opening wide horizons to souls, and of saving them from many dangers and illusions which they could easily fall if they were obliged to remain in that which has been called the ordinary way of sanctity. Some authors do not look with sympathy on the mystical way because they believe it to be filled with dangers and pitfalls, but in reality the contrary is true. In the mystical state, souls are governed in a special manner by the Holy Spirit himself, operating through his precious gifts and divine motion. Illumined by the light of contemplation, they discover much better their nothingness and their misery. At the same time, they see the snares of the enemies in their own sensuality. They are much more cautious, prudent, and docile to their spiritual masters, because of the passive purifications to which they have been subjected. There is, therefore, no doubt that the passive purifications which, according to the unanimous teachings of all the schools of spirituality, are of a mystical order, are necessary and indispensable from one form or another to the purification of the soul, and for arriving at complete Christian perfection. Let us now see in particular the two principal manifestations of these passive purifications, which St. John of the Cross calls the night of the senses and the night of the spirit. Night of the senses. The night of the senses consists of a prolonged series of profound and persistent erities that submerge the soul in a very painful state and severely test its perseverance in the desire for sanctification. It is so difficult to support this crisis of the senses that many souls draw back in fear and abandon the life of prayer. No one has explained with such precision and clarity as has St. John of the Cross the nature, necessity, causes, and effects of these passive purifications. Above all, it is necessary to note that St. John of the Cross includes under the word senses not only the external and internal senses, but the sensitive appetite and the discursive intellect, so far as it uses the imagination to construct its discourses. He begins by describing the sweetness that beginners usually experience in the service of God. They may become strongly attached to the sensible consolations and, without realizing it, make the delight and sweetness they find in the practices of devotion the principal motive for which they practice them. On feeling themselves so favored by God, they think they are already saints, or not far from being saints. As a result, they are manifest many imperfections that flow from the 7 capital sins. A profound purification is needed, but these souls could never achieve it by their own efforts, even if they could recognize all their faults. Therefore, God intervenes and leads them into the night of the senses. They have now had practice for some time in the way of virtue and have persevered in meditation and prayer. Because of the sweetness and pleasure they have found therein, they have lost their love of the things of the world and have gained some degree of spiritual strength in God, When they are going about these spiritual exercises with the greatest delight and pleasure, and when they believe the sun of divine favor is shining more brightly upon them, God turns all this light and theirs into darkness and shuts the door against them, and the source of the sweet spiritual water which they were tasting in God whenever and for as long as they desired, and thus he leaves them so completely in the dark they do not know whither to go with their sensible imagination and meditation, for they cannot advance a step in meditation as they were accustomed to do before, their inward senses being submerged in this night and left with such dryness that not only do they experience no pleasure and consolation in spiritual things and good exercises in which they are wont to find their delights and pleasures, but instead they find insipidity and a bitterness in the things mentioned. St. John of the Cross expressly states that the cause of this emptiness and insipidity of the senses is infused contemplation. The soul can no longer meditate or reflect in the imaginative sphere of sense as it used to, however much it may attempt to do so. For God now begins to communicate himself to it, no longer through the senses as he did before, but by an act of simple contemplation, in which neither the exterior nor the interior senses of the lower part of the soul can attain. How can one discern the presence of the night of the senses, and distinguish it from the dryness or aridity that may be caused by other reasons, such as dissipation, bodily indisposition, or influence of the devil? St. John of the Cross gives 3 signs. 1. The first sign is that the soul finds delight or consolation neither in the things of God nor in any created thing. If the soul were to find consolation in the latter, it is evident that its distaste for the things of God would be due to a dissipation of the soul. But since this universal dryness or distaste could come from some indisposition of the body that caused one to lose one's taste for everything, it is necessary to add the second sign. 2. The second sign is that ordinarily the memory is fixed on God with great care, but the soul thinks that, rather than serving God, it is falling back, because of its lack of taste for the things of God. One can see that the distaste does not proceed from lukewarmness, because it is the nature of lukewarmness not to have any interior solicitude of the things of God, and if it comes from some bodily infirmity, everything becomes distasteful, and there is not any desire to serve God, nor would the devil arouse any desire to serve God. For that reason, this second sign is one of the most unmistakable. 3. The third sign is the inability to meditate or use reasoning by means of the imagination as one formerly did. The reason for this impotency is due to the initial infused contemplation. When these signs are all verified in a clear manner, the soul and the spiritual director can conclude that they are in the presence of the night of the senses and can act accordingly. But for greater certitude we shall investigate the matter much further in order to verify with certainty whether the aridity of the soul experiences in this state is due to the night of the senses or to one of the other causes. If it is an effect of lukewarmness, it can be known very easily because the distaste for the things of God will be accompanied by a strong inclination for recreation and worldly diversion, together with a dissipation of soul that sometimes runs the risk of mortal sin and commits venial sin without any resistance. The remedy for this is to repent sincerely and to return again with new fervor to the road of the spiritual life. If it is a question of mental infirmity or nervous imbalance, it is not difficult to distinguish it from the aridity of the night of the senses. To distinguish neurasthenia from passive purification, we should note that the most frequent symptoms in neurasthenics are the follows: almost continual fatigue, even when they have not worked, accompanied by a feeling of prostration, of discouragement, habitual headaches, insomnia, to the extent that the neurasthenius wakes up more tired than when he went to bed, difficulty in exercising the intellectual faculties and in maintaining attention, impressionably intense emotions for very slight causes, which lead the sufferer to believe that he has illnesses that he does not really have, excessive self-analysis even to minute details, and continual preoccupation not to become ill. Neurasthenics are, however, not imaginary invalids. The powerlessness they experience is real, and it would be very important to urge them to disregard their fatigue and work to the limit of their strength. What they lack is not will, but power. We should also note that the psychoneurosis may be associated with a developed intellectual life and a lofty moral life. But we see also that passive night is distinguished from the state of nervous fatigue by the second sign. The soul ordinarily keeps the memory of God with solicitude and painful anxiety for fear it may be falling back. By the third sign, the quasi-impossibility to meditate, but the ability to keep a simple and loving gaze on God, the beginning of the infused compilation. The ardent desire for God and for perfection, which is manifested by these signs, distinguishes notably this passive purgation from neurasthenia, which may sometimes coexist with it. If it is a question of diabolical temptation or disturbance, which God permits as a means of purifying a soul, it will be known from the fact that aridity is accompanied by strong, sinful suggestions of an unusual tenacity, together with an instinctive horror of the soul towards such suggestions. The devil tries to disturb the peace and tranquility of the soul and to withdraw it from the practice of prayer. The soul will conquer the devil by insisting, in spite of its repugnance, on its exercises of piety, and by other methods for conquering the devil that we indicated when discussing diabolical temptation. Chapter 7. Sometimes one or another of these states may coincide with the night of the senses, and especially the second or third. In this case, a careful, penetrating analysis is required in order to discern what pertains to one or another cause and to correct it with the proper remedies. Sometimes also there will be concomitant trials of various kinds. On the part of the devil there are terrible temptations against faith, hope, and charity, strong suggestions against purity accompanied by phantasms in the imagination, a spirit of blasphemy so violent and strong that at times one is almost forced to pronounce the words, and this is grave torment to the soul, as St. John of the Cross states, obscurities that fill the soul with 1,000 scruples and perplexities, and other similar afflictions. Again, there may be persecutions and ridicule, sometimes from the good people, which is one of the greatest tribulations one is forced to suffer, or one's own superior and friends or spiritual director may torment the soul by judging its state to be one of lukewarmness, and not being able to discover the proper remedies to alleviate its condition. Lastly, there may be infirmities, misfortunes, and loss of one's good name or friends or possessions. It would seem at times that heaven and earth have conspired against the soul, but God is permitting all these things in order to detach it completely from the things of earth, to remind it that it can do nothing without him, and how much it needs his divine mercy and assistance. Not all souls suffer the night of the senses to the same degree. It depends on the grade of perfection to which God intends to elevate the soul, the greater or fewer number of imperfections from which the soul must be purified, or the forces and energies of the soul itself, and its docility and patience in supporting this painful trial. There are always degrees of more and less in these purifications, but God always gives his grace and strength in the measure needed by the soul. During the dark night of the senses, the soul should observe the following forms of conduct: complete and loving submission to the will of God, accepting with patience and resignation the painful trial for as long a time as God decrees. The soul should not consider this purgative state as something evil, but see it as a means of fortifying itself and of making progress in the spiritual life. This is the advice given by St. John of the Cross in chapter 10, book 1 of the Dark Night. 2. Perseverance in prayer in spite of all difficulty, in imitation of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, who even in his agony prayed with greater intensity. Luke 22:43. Prayer in the midst of these terrible aridities is a veritable torment for the soul, and only by means of force exerted upon oneself can the soul persevere in it. But it is necessary that the soul should do so, asking God for strength, if it does not wish to fall back and lose everything. This is the point at which many souls turn back. Tormented by these agonies of the dark night, they abandoned the life of prayer, but they were on the point of receiving the grace that make great strides along the road to sanctity. But it is necessary that the soul knows that it is being led into a new type of prayer, and it would be a great imprudence to try and use the former method of prayer. The soul should remain in peace and quiet, content simply with the loving gaze of God, without any particular consideration, and without any desire for delight or sensation. The reason is that the soul is receiving infused contemplation, which has nothing to do with the methods of ascetical prayer. St. John of the Cross explains, although further scruples may come to them, that they are wasting their time and that it would be well for them to do something else, because they can neither do nor think nor anything in prayer, let them suffer these scruples and remain in peace. If such a soul should desire to make any effort of its own with interior faculties, it will hinder and lose blessings which God is instilling into it and impressing upon it. For these reasons, such a soul should pay no heed if the operation of its faculties become lost to it. It would rather desire that this happen quickly, for by not hindering the operation of infused contemplation which God is bestowing upon it, it can receive this with more peaceful abundance, and cause its spirit to be enkindled and burn with the love that is this dark and secret contemplation brings with it and sets firmly in the soul. The reason is that all the imperfections and disorders of the sensual parts have their strength and root in the spirit, where all habits, both good and bad, are brought into subjection, and thus, until these are purged, the rebellions and depravities of sense cannot be purged thoroughly. The cause of the night of the spirit are the same as those of the night of the senses, namely infused contemplation and the imperfection of the soul, although in a higher degree of intensity as regards the contemplative light. The excess of this light torments and blinds the soul at the same time that it manifests to the soul its smallest and most insignificant imperfection. The contrast between the ineffable grandeur of God as seen through the splendor of contemplation and the dross of imperfections and miseries that the soul discovers in itself makes the soul feel that an intimate union between such great light and such great darkness is impossible, and that the soul is condemned to live eternally separated from God. This situation, which seems most evident and beyond remedy, submerges the soul into a state of anguish and torture so terrifying that it surpasses the torments of purgatory, in which the souls have the assurance of eternal salvation. The principal source of suffering in this night is an apparent abandonment by God. The soul is deprived of all delight and satisfaction in relations with God. It is closed in upon itself, faced with its own misery and lowliness. God appears as a ruthless and avenging judge. The soul desires more than ever to serve God, but feels that it can in no way be acceptable to God. Although actually in a high state of perfection, it feels desolate rather than favored by God. It would welcome death as a release from its torture. But the soul that passes through the night comes forth from this trial, resplendent and beautiful, completely transformed in God, and free forever from its weakness, imperfections, and miseries. Having been completely purified of them by the terrible mystical purgatory it has suffered, it scales the heights of sanctity, is confirmed in grace, and awaits only death to break the bonds that still hold it in this world, in order to penetrate the eternal splendors of the beatific vision. Is the night of the Spirit necessary in order to reach Christian perfection? In order to attain relative perfection that corresponds to the souls that have passed through the fifth and are entering upon the sixth mansions, described by St. Teresa, a contemplative prayer of quiet and of union, the dark night of the Spirit is not necessary. God can supply, and has, in fact, supplied for the purification of the night of the spirits by means of other intermittent trials, alternating light with darkness, until he raises the soul to the degree of purity and perfection which he had predestined it. But in order for anyone to reach the seventh mansions of transforming union and to scale the very heights of sanctity, the night of the Spirit is indispensable. St. John of the Cross states this many times, and it must be so by the very nature of things. The soul cannot be united with God in the transforming union until it has been totally purified of all its weakness and misery. And this is the proper effect of the night of the Spirit. It should be evident that there cannot be any fixed rule concerning the night of the Spirit because circumstances are too variable. But these painful purifications usually last for a long period of time, sometimes for years, before the soul is admitted to the transforming union, or mystical marriage. From time to time, God is wont to lift his hand and let the soul breathe. But if it is a question of the true night of the Spirit, these periods of relaxation are very brief. The soul immediately returns to the terrible pains and torture until the trial is finished by its entrance into the last classified degree of perfection, which is the transforming union. The passive purgations of the Spirit, when they are intermittent, extend throughout the illuminative and unitive way. But when it is a question of the true night of the Spirit, they occur between the sixth and seventh mansions described by St. Teresa, that is to say, when the soul is already far advanced in the unitive way and prior to its entrance into the transforming union, for which the night is a preparation. Anyone who reads St. John of the Cross can see that, when he says that God places the soul in this terrible night to lead it to divine union, he is not referring to the unitive way taken in its entirety, but to the transforming union, which is the final union to which the soul attains. Otherwise it would be necessary to exclude from the unitive way the marvelous phenomena of ecstatic union, which do not appear in the transforming union, and which, nevertheless, pertain to the unitive way according to the traditional teaching. The attempt to fit the purgative, illuminative, and unitive stages of the spiritual life into the fourfold action, active and passive nights of the senses, and the spirit may appear rather tedious and strained to contemporary theologians. It is better, perhaps, to stress the continuous development, differentiated by greater or lesser intensity. Father John Arentero has described the dark night of the Spirit in great detail, and he places at the height of the unitive way prior to the transforming union. We quote a small part of his description as a fitting conclusion to our study of the active and passive purgations. That this union may be changed from the conforming union to the transforming union, God himself must look in the soul in the matter that is hidden, mysterious, and painful. He rids the soul of all sensible delights, which it experienced in the former union, wherein the delight of the Spirit redounded to the senses. God seemed to hide himself now, but actually he is much more intimately united to the soul. The soul is amazed at the very change it now experiences. It believes itself to be abandoned, yet it finds that it is improved in every way. The change is most profitable, but the soul is unable to understand how this can be so. In the formidable spiritual darkness wherein the soul is buried in its mystical cocoon and is incapacitated for working by itself or for possessing any initiative at all, it believes itself to be imprisoned or buried in hell itself. Nevertheless, it is gradually undergoing the mysterious change from the conforming to the transforming union although the soul itself is scarcely aware of it. It is verified, the obscure and prolonged interior activity which the soul and disposes them for the mystical espousal. Later it leads them gradually to the total transformation which is required for the mystical marriage.